My name is Michael Goldberg, for those who I have not met before, and I'm the Executive Director of our Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship at Case Western Reserve University. I also teach entrepreneurship in our business school, and it's my pleasure to welcome my good friend and college roommate, Robert Musselwhite, to our speaker series. We were actually planning on trying to do this in person because Robert does work with a number of our leaders in the healthcare industry in Cleveland. So we were planning for that. And then in the New World Order, everything's via Zoom. So it's great to have him here today. And Allison, help me pronounce your last name. We were practicing for your graduation and then I forgot.
Yeah, now that it's virtual, you're off the hook, but it's Smozinski.
Allison Smozinski is a second-year full-time MBA student who's graduating in May and heading off to Google, and is a former colleague of Robert's from the advisory board. So we made the connection that when she told me where she used to work, I'm like, you may have known this guy who used to work there, Robert Musselwhite. So when we were able to line Robert up to do this, Allison was my first choice to be our moderator. So the way we'll do it today, for those who are on Facebook and those who are on Zoom, Allison's going to moderate, and please let her know if you have a question. You can either put it in the chat and let her know that you'd like to ask it directly to Robert, or she can read the question. If you're on Facebook, put it in the comments, and then Doug DiGirolamo, who's my colleague who's on, waving his hand, will read it or post it in the thing so Allison can do it. And we'll have an hour together. So with that, Allison, let me turn it over to you. And Robert, thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Professor Goldberg. And it's exciting to be here today. As Professor Goldberg mentioned, I spent 6 years at the advisory board company. So I was very fortunate to be under the leadership of Robert and had a terrific experience there. So it's very exciting and full circle today to be able to help moderate and ask him questions, both about his time at advisory board, his career, and then certainly as we face challenges today within the healthcare space. So before we jump into questions, I'll pass it over to Robert to introduce himself. But as Professor Goldberg mentioned, please feel free to either raise your hand in the chat, put questions in there, and I'm more than happy to either read them myself or make sure that we're able to set you up so you can go ahead and ask Robert.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on still in the virtual world. I was hoping to come in person, and I guess we'll do that next fall or whenever time permits. There is something really entertaining about having one of your closest friends in the world who you've known since you're 18 years old be called professor by other people. So I still get a kick out of him being called Professor Goldberg. We all called him Goldie. If you guys want to call him Goldie, if you like him enough, and if he likes you enough, he'll let you call him Goldie. But understand the formality. He's been a great friend, and he's probably our most adventurous world traveler among all of us, and is probably the most worldly. He's been to almost every place in the world if you talk to him, and has been an inspiration certainly to me in terms of doing a little more travel and seeing a little more of the world. Obviously not right now, but hopefully again once things open up. And it's been fun to watch him in his role at the Veale Institute and at Case, and it's been really fun to see what he's put together. So I'm thrilled to be part of it here today. I'll give you guys quick background and I'll just cover it quickly and then we can dive into questions. So I'm currently CEO of OptumInsight, which is one of 3 divisions of Optum. Optum is the health services arm of United Health Group. So many of you may have healthcare with United Healthcare or know of United Healthcare. That's the insurance side of the company. We're actually about the same size. Optum is, but it's all the services part of the company. So within Optum, there's a pharmacy benefit manager. That's a group called OptumRx. There is a group that runs a bunch of physicians in the country. So they have about 55,000, mostly primary care doctors, but also specialty surgery, outpatient surgery centers and MedExpress clinics. But that's called Optum Health. That's another part of the business. And then what's under me is all the software services, data analytics, consulting, research, any services provided out to the healthcare industry. We really work with all parts of the healthcare industry. So hospitals, payers, doctors, state governments, life sciences companies, really anyone who touches healthcare in my division. It's about a $10 billion division. We have about 35,000 people around the world. And I came to this role, or came to Optum by virtue of the advisory board company where Allison and I worked together several years ago. The advisory board was a healthcare research company focused mostly on providers, but a research data and analytics company. It was about a 40-year-old company, and based in Washington, D.C. In fact, for a lot of people who are our age who lived in Washington, D.C., they worked at the advisory board at some point in their career. It's funny how many people I run into. It's like, oh, yeah, I was there after college for a couple of years. Hire a lot of young people. It's a great place to work. And in particular with providers, but because that was a lot of our expertise in relationships with health systems. So when Professor Goldberg talks about coming to Cleveland for work, a lot of times I'll meet with the Cleveland Clinic or with university, or some of the other institutions in town, and we're hoping at some point, I don't want to tease it too much, but to get one of the CEOs of the major health systems in Cleveland to join us sometime on the show here. So they're both clients, at least the university and Cleveland Clinic are, and we'll do a lot of work closely with them as one example. So I've been really fortunate that Optum's actually been a great place to work. Happy to talk about being acquired. If that's part of where some of the questions come, happy to talk about healthcare, happy to talk about the work that we're doing in the current crisis, but really open to your questions, and y'all can lead it wherever you want to go, Michael and Allison.
Great, thank you. To kick things off, I know that one piece that's certainly on the forefront of my mind and probably everyone on this call is COVID-19 and how that looks for your role, how that's changed your day-to-day. So if you don't mind, I would love for us to start there.
Yeah, sure. So I'll do it from like a business and then a broader industry perspective. From a business perspective, the thing that we've seen the most inside my business is we have a pretty large business serving hospitals and health systems, and that business has totally changed. So for almost every client in that space, as you've seen in the news, they have really ramped down on everything other than COVID-19 treatments. So pushing off elective surgeries, pushing off any care that's not urgent and needed, and even in some cases, unfortunately, care that might have been urgent and needed, to clear the decks to be sure that they have enough capacity in beds and ICU equipment to treat COVID-19 patients. And in many parts of the country, that's been a great move because they've been overrun. Obviously, you've read about New York and a while back in the Seattle area. In other parts of the country, it's meant a lot of slack capacity that hasn't necessarily been replaced by COVID patients. And even where it has been replaced by COVID patients, for those of you who know healthcare, generally a lot of the procedures that have been pushed off are covered by commercial insurance, tend to be reimbursed at high rates. They tend to make a lot of their profitability off that stuff. Surgeries, cancer treatments, other types of quote elective procedures, or other procedures that aren't long sick hospital stays. Most COVID-19 patients don't have the same insurance profile. There are a lot of Medicaid, a lot of Medicare, happens to be a lot of older people, and they have long hospital stays. If someone's really sick enough to come to the hospital for COVID, they end up a lot of times staying. The average length of stay is over 11 days at this point. So for hospitals, it's a disaster on the financial front. So the longer that they end up in this situation, the more problematic it's going to be for that industry. And that obviously affects our business. A lot of the business we would do with hospitals has slowed down or gone away. Some of it's volume-based, and where it's volume-based, those volumes have really fallen off. So that's been tough to manage from a business perspective. But I think the bigger thing that matters for all of us is, the financial situation of hospitals. If this crisis goes on a long time and you can't resume the elective procedures, the other procedures, the normal treatments where they make all their money, you will see hospitals go bankrupt. And that's why you see Congress investing so much in supporting providers during this, because the hope is that, and you're seeing this in some places like California, elective procedures starting to come back. When you see that starting to happen, that'll be a better sign for hospitals that they can get their finances back in order. If you don't see that for 3, 4, 5 months, you'll start to see some real strain in that part of healthcare. And then that'll have repercussions on a lot of other parts of the industry, medical device suppliers, pharmaceutical companies. I mean, there's just a lot of things that are suppliers to hospitals, physicians. A lot of physicians right now, if they're specialized in an area where procedures have been pushed off, they're not getting income. And maybe they're being redeployed if they're an employee of a health system to support COVID patients, but in a lot of cases, they're having their pay cut or being laid off or furloughed. And that's also, so you see the repercussions of this impact on hospitals reverberating throughout the rest of healthcare. The only other comment I'd say, again, from an industry perspective, is that it's a little bit unclear the effect on insurers. So in our company, we're still waiting to kind of see how this quarter goes, but those same procedures that make a lot of money for hospitals comprise a lot of the costs for a health insurance company. And so there's a lot of thinking that, if you see this effect on hospitals, you'll see the reverse effect on insurers, which is their insured patients won't be spending as much on healthcare this quarter, their medical costs will go down, their profitability would go up. Across United Health Group, so Optum and United Healthcare, we have both effects. So I think, we'll kind of see how they counter each other. And then today, one of the insurers announced Centene, and they actually had a big negative impact on their own medical costs. So it's still unclear on how this is all going to play out for the healthcare industry. It is disruptive at a minimum, and probably, not a great thing for a lot of institutions that matter and care for a lot of people, because it's going to put them in a pretty tight situation. On the personal side on COVID, I told Michael I'd be happy to share this. I actually was an early COVID patient, fortunately not a severe case. So I've recovered, but it does open your eyes to so many things. So I guess I'll share 3 observations. One is that, so I was exposed at a conference that we held. We were told about 4 days after the conference that someone there had tested positive for COVID and that we should self-quarantine. So when I found that out, I had already started feeling sick. I self-quarantined. I basically had a fever for 24 hours, had a headache, sore throat. Felt really tired and lethargic, hard time getting up in the morning, tired at night, didn't feel like having a glass of wine or beer, which is unusual. Professor Goldberg can tell you. So I called my doctor, and she said, you should probably go get tested. I couldn't go into the doctor. They didn't want to see me, but they could talk by phone. And the ordeal of trying to get a test was eye-opening. Like, I know a lot about healthcare. I understood how it worked. The doctor had said, you probably have it. You should get tested. And it still took finding an urgent care center that had the tests, going in. It took about, an hour and a half of waiting. I was in contact with several people there. I mean, it was not a good experience. And so you think, gosh, I'm a healthier middle-aged person. Imagine an older, sicker, scared person trying to get a test and navigate the system. It's got to be almost impossible in some places. So that was observation number 1, and that's a bummer. Number 2 is it took 9 days to get my test results. So I think that's improved with some of the tests that are out today, but not all of them. And 9 days for a disease that can, sometimes run 2 weeks, and you might have been sick for a while before you finally get tested. It's really not so helpful. Now, if people are self-quarantining, that's fine. But if people are using the test as a barometer of whether they're safe to be around others, if you kind of look to the reopening, 9 days isn't going to cut it. It just, by the time I got the test results, I was kind of surprised I had it because I was feeling largely better. And then the third thing that, I do a lot of research into immunity and what it means to have had it and recovered. And there's a couple things about this disease we still don't know yet. And so a lot of the assumptions about reopening are based on the fact that if someone's had it or been exposed and has antibodies, that they will be immune. And I saw Dr. Fauci speaking today in a forum, and they really don't know what kind of immunity having it or being exposed to it and not getting sick affords you. And so there's still more work to be done on that front. And until we know that, I don't think it's unfortunate. I'm still super careful, and I'm not acting like I'm immune at all because I don't really know how that's going to play out. I'm hopeful. I mean, I think there's enough evidence that would say that you should be immune for at least a period of time. The disease hasn't mutated much. Most people who have had it have not gotten it again, although there have been some cases where it seems they have. And so hopefully that's the case. But if we're looking for that to be one of our tickets through this, we really need to understand whether immunity truly holds and how good we feel. And also if we are going to have a vaccine, we need to know that there's immunity conferred by having the antibodies. So if you're going to do a vaccine to help people build up antibodies, you need to know that's going to actually deliver immunity. So I think those are the 3 things that have been interesting about it. I'm okay talking about it. Some people aren't. I think some people still feel like they're going to be shamed or shunned in public if they're a COVID patient. I mean, 1 million people have had this thing, probably more than that, and people don't even know it. So my theory is that most people are probably at some point going to be exposed to this, and whether they get it or not will just depend a little bit on, and how severe a case depends on the factors that you read about. But that's, I know, a long answer to a short question, Allison, but I think this is, for the healthcare industry, it's definitely it's going to create a ton of change. And like what comes out of this, I mean, you can read it in the paper and I think probably come up with a lot of your own ideas about this, but no question that remote care is going to be on the rise. No question that the experience with a doctor is all going to change. I think there'll be a lot more openness to doing things over the web or online or by phone. Prescribing behavioral change, the sort of in-person interaction is going to be limited to certain places where it's absolutely necessary. And there was already a movement underfoot to move more care to the home or to remote settings, but insurers hadn't really supported the change in policy, and Medicare hadn't. Now they've changed it. I don't think they'll ever change it back. So I think you're in a world where this is now going to be a big accelerant. The trend of hospitals closing or removing beds, like inpatient beds, may still happen, but there'll have to be some strategic reserve if something like this were to happen again, where we could massively ramp up capacity if needed. And so I hope that the government will take seriously preparedness for the next time and think about, care spikes, vaccine need spikes, medication need spikes, and be better prepared to act as a nation first and globally second, in concert to be able to address something like this if it were to happen again, because we clearly weren't prepared this time around.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing that information. And it's very helpful to see, even as someone who's CEO of this organization, how you're trying to navigate this in just like the rest of us, of taking this both from a personal and industry perspective. We have a follow-up question from John that I'm going to go ahead and read here that actually ties in line with what you were just mentioning as well. So what John asked, and let me pull this up here, is he said that large-scale hospital bankruptcy would be difficult, to say the least, but as attention-getting as that sounds, the more appropriate to ask general questions about basic healthcare funding in general, not asking a politically angled question, as I'm sure Rob and his firm are always thinking about status quo versus new models. How has COVID crisis changed his scenario planning?
Oh, that's a great question. And so I assume the question is for our own business and how we're thinking about scenario planning. So we look at it in multiple horizons. So the first, obviously, and for my business, we're having significant business impact from our provider business. And so the question is, how long will the volumes that went away go away? That's kind of the fundamental question. We sort of know what the new normal is for volumes being pushed off. We've had a huge volume decline. So for any place where we are, for example, managing the revenue cycle of a client, so we help a hospital process its claims, get the claims paid, kind of manage all that back office stuff. We tend to get paid on the amount of the number of claims that come through that process, or the dollar value of claims that come through that process in a lot of those relationships. So for a typical institution that might have been at 100% in February, they're probably at 30% now. So you can imagine that's a direct reflection of their own finances and their own impact on revenues, and it affects us. So we need to use models for how long that's going to continue to play out. And we have a ton of modeling we've done. Luckily, we have all the analytics of Optum within my group, and so we've had a multi-local model we've been running since the beginning of this crisis that projects volume cases, impact volumes of things like supplies, available capacity in that market, and how that's going to play out with the health system in that community. And we've been using that for our purposes in planning, and then also sharing that with clients as an example, and working with clients on preparedness. And so we have several scenarios about how long it will last, and that obviously impacts how we react to it. Number two, interestingly enough, the big push right now is, what does return to work look like? So we are planning for what does it mean for employees to go. Most of our employees are working from home, except where they absolutely can't, like many businesses. But the question is, how many employees should go back to an office-based environment in the next phase? And I think the answer is many fewer than we had before. And I'm not sure that'll ever change again. So we're looking a lot at how do employees feel about working from home? How productive are they working from home? What types of jobs are able to be worked from home productively, and which need to be in the office? If some are hybrids, do people need an assigned space, or do they just need a space when they have a client meeting? For jobs that were travel before, how much travel is going to be part of that job? There's all kinds of questions that go into that. And we're doing a ton of scenario planning around that to figure out what our real estate footprint and what the new office of the future is going to look like. And then included in that, obviously, is all the safety dimensions of if you bring people back to work, what do you need to have in the workplace to make it safe? That's the second area we look at. And then the third, and I think this is probably where the question was going, so I probably should have started with this, is, what's healthcare going to look like and what does that mean for our business? And that's always a balance of what are the risks? So for example, if we see real strain in the hospital sector, are we doing the right things for hospitals? Or do there need to be a whole new set of services that we do for them? Or is there something that we're doing now they're going to need even more of? That's kind of the first set of questions. And then number two, all the trends that we're going to see play out in healthcare, does that present different business opportunities for us? So if care is going to go more to the home, and there's going to be a different model of what people go access care in person for, what does that mean for our business? Like, how should we be thinking about delivering our services? How should we be thinking about what types of clients we'll have? Are there new sets of clients out there? Should we be serving consumers and patients directly in my part of the business versus through clients? So it raises a lot of questions around, really strategic questions around what the business should look like in a couple of years as you look beyond this. And no one really knows, but I think there's a few trends that are happening that are clear enough. And, we've seen enough of it now to say I'd bet behind, and those are some of them. So we're doing a lot of that right now as well. And then I guess that plays into, where do you make investments now versus wait and see? The trade-off on that, for those of you who are, entrepreneurs, this, it's okay. Do you wait and see and risk being kind of a fast follower or, part of the herd, not the immune herd, but like the herd of betting on a future trend, or do you try to get ahead of it now and make a big investment? So there are a lot of things we could go buy right now. It would probably be a good time to buy them. Public company valuations are lower, private company valuations, a lot of them have financing questions in this environment. So we could go be bolder against some future trends and probably get a deal. But we might risk not knowing how things are going to play out. It might be better served by watching and learning a little bit before we did it, but then we would be a little bit slower to be ahead of that trend. I'd say there's 3 or 4 pretty large decisions we're sitting on right now that are all in that category that, I think we're going to have to make a call on how aggressively do we go after it now, based on how certain we feel about the future. We don't feel that certain. So it's, those can be a little bit challenging or stressful decisions, but probably should make some of those. We probably should make some bets. So I don't know if there's more to the question, I'm happy to answer it. I mean, there's a whole bunch of planning. It's kind of normal business planning plus a bunch of contingencies that we never thought we'd be considering that we now have to weigh.
Great, thank you. We had another question come in from Neil, and what Neil requested to hear a little bit more about is, does he, meaning you, Robert, have a perspective on the use of digital certificates or other technologies that will enable people to safely go back to work, entertainment, etc.?
Yeah, so I'll start with the one caveat that I don't think we really understand immunity yet. So immunity needs to be demonstrated. I think it will be, but this thing hasn't been around long enough to be able to demonstrate that there's a reliable test of true immunity. So that, and without that, certificate won't have much impact. Assuming that we feel good about at least a period of immunity following having the disease or being exposed to it and having antibodies, I personally feel like one of the tickets to getting back to work is knowing who those people are. And there are obviously privacy implications and things like that, but I think in this crisis, I think people would probably be willing to make that trade to start to know that people who were let into a certain establishment or back to work had been either screened or were already immune. And so you would have a high degree of confidence that any workspace you entered or any public establishment that you entered had a very low chance of having someone who was spreading the virus in it. I mean, that would be, I think, a real confidence builder for people coming back to work. Like, we can reopen the states, but if people don't feel comfortable, it's gonna be hard to get people to really go back to work and change things. So what you want things to reopen up and provide a lot of confidence to people that their safety is gonna be looked after. So I think that for a digital certificate or a passport of immunity or anything like that, I'd be in favor of it. But we have to know that it's actually a mark of something that's real, and that is, the immunity is really going to last. And I think that's one important thing among several that have to be in place for people to feel good about starting to get out and about in ways that feel a little bit more normal. And from a workplace perspective, that's another one I didn't mention, but when we open the workplace, what kind of testing should we have? Do we need to be taking people's temperature at the door to work? Do we need to be, knowing people who are immune and they can come in freely, whereas people who don't have that protection need to be tested? And there's all kinds of questions around that, and they're all balanced, safety and wellness and care for your employees balanced against privacy interests. And quite honestly, just, you can't have it be so burdensome that you can't be productive either. So there's a lot to weigh there.
I think that's a question that's up in there for all of us, is when do we slowly start to return to normal, and then what is the new normal? We had another question come in, switching gears a little bit here, and I know as a former employee, this is something that I'm very interested in hearing about as well. But can you talk a little bit more about the acquisition by United, and then certainly the EAB, which for those of you that aren't as familiar, EAB was the education side of the advisory board that spun off as well. So a little bit more about that, and then some of the pain points associated with that, and then some of the things that went better than expected.
Yep. So real quick primer on EAB. So the healthcare side of the advisory board served almost every hospital and health system in the US, originally as a research provider and then evolved into other services, membership-based services, really liaising with the C-suite of each health system around their most important issues. We built a higher education business because we felt like the college university industry was a lot like at least a lot like the hospital part of the healthcare industry. So if you think about it, it's a lot of government funding, a lot of organizations who succeed a lot individually, but don't often share best practices and don't often have a lot of best practices that they've adopted. I think they would willingly say that. So a great forum for learning from the best and being able to disseminate those best practices. And, a place where data and analytics could really make a difference. So a place where we felt like we could bring a lot of science to a lot of the decisions that were made in running a college or university. So built up a business that looked a lot like the advisory board, was the same for the education side. So in 2017, we had made a larger acquisition in the education side. So we had an education business that was, give or take, half the size of our healthcare business. As a public company, we were finding ways, we hope to kind of keep both businesses under one roof, but public investors, there aren't really a lot of education public company investors. Most of our investors were healthcare investors. And so it was pretty clear that the value of that business was going to have more value not being part of a public healthcare company. And we went through a strategic review. We dealt with an activist investor. We had a lot happen that year to try to figure out what was the right path for us. And we ended up, the sort of highest value path that we found through our work was to sell EAB to a private equity firm. So they're now part of Vista Equity Partners. They're private equity owned. They've been doing very well, obviously, pre-crisis. The crisis is tough on colleges and universities, as you guys probably know. And we were acquired by Optum as part of that transaction. So that was a very complex transaction. Our lawyers said it was probably the most complex transaction they have or ever will work on in their careers. And I can go into that for any of you who are M&A junkies. There's a lot of complexity to spinning off part of the business and selling them simultaneously to two different buyers. All that said, the vision of bringing the advisory board to Optum has really held true. It's, again, I talked about this earlier, advisory board was really, or especially was really understanding hospitals and health systems, knowing what their key concerns were, knowing what solutions they needed, which solutions worked, and then how to bring those to them in a way that made sense to the industry. And Optum historically had not, they had a provider business, but it wasn't a deep provider business. It was a lot of back office technology, a few strategic relationships, but really not in the same position as the advisory board. The advisory board was a small company, but had great C-level relationships and a deep understanding of hospitals and health systems. So putting the two together, we really have become the front end, especially in the hospital and health system market for Optum, and putting together all of Optum's amazing capabilities and services. And Optum, the scale of what Optum can bring, dwarfs whatever the advisory board could do for a client. So we always knew things we wanted to do, but we were a small company and couldn't necessarily make the investments or have the same scale and capacity to do them. Now we have that. And so that's been the best thing about the combination, is that advisory board has really played a central role in helping build up and lead a whole new level of partnership with health systems for Optum, and really for United Health Group more broadly. That's been great. On a personal employee level, like I said, we had a lot of young people at the advisory board. Our executive team had been there a long time. It was a great place to work. It was an awesome company. It was fun, entrepreneurial. But as a healthcare company of that size, scale at some point was going to matter. And so I don't think the future of the advisory board was to stay independent forever. There was going to be something where we needed to evolve as healthcare has really evolved. And coming into Optum, I've found it to be really interesting, and I'm learning about new parts of healthcare that I didn't spend a lot of time in, like the payer market and life sciences. For our employees who have stayed through the acquisition period, they tend to have really good positions. I mean, Optum really looks to them as their leaders on the healthcare side, on the provider side especially. They've done very well, but of course, a lot of employees, didn't sign up to be part of a 300,000 person company. And so a lot of our employees have moved on, and that's also healthy. You look across the industry and there are a lot of really amazing advisory board alums doing awesome things at different companies. And so it's become kind of, G network within healthcare, things like that, where you just have a lot of talented employees who have now gone on to do new things and to really have their own impact on the industry in different ways. So the acquisition was not easy. I'm happy to talk more about, going through that. Integration was not easy, but I think if you kind of look back on it and look at why we came to Optum and the strategy behind it, that all has been great. And so at the end of the day, while it's a tough process to go through, I think it's been a really healthy process and a good outcome for both sides as we kind of give it 2 years of perspective at this point. And I've really enjoyed it. I'm staying, and I love my new role. I moved into this role in August. And I think, the nice thing about Optum, going back to what I was saying before, is the ability to have a huge impact on healthcare. It really is. I mean, it's the largest healthcare company in the world, United Health Group, and Optum is certainly the largest services, analytics, and data and technology player in the market. The ability to really help, and especially during a time like this, is awesome.
Thanks for sharing that. I know there's some other former advisory board Optum employees on the line, so I think I speak for all.
All right.
It's really
thanks for joining, you guys.
It's really interesting to hear that perspective. I'd love to turn it over, instead of me continuing to talk here, to Fahima. Would you mind sharing your question with the group?
Sure. So, hi, this is Famida.
Hey, Famida.
Hi. I had two questions. One, I wanted to know if you, on the analytics side, are maybe running any models to allow for better prediction of COVID or similar viruses like that in the future. And then the other question I had is, you talked a little bit about care moving more towards remote and home. With COVID, a lot of systems have now been put in place. And so we can do more remote, but I was wondering if you had some additional information on what do you think care will look like in the future post-COVID? How is care going to shift, and what will we be doing as patients and as doctors and as hospitals?
Yeah, so remind me your first question. I started focusing on your second.
Oh, the first one was, are you running any analytics to help with better prediction in the future?
Sure, so I'll take both those. On the first one, we actually had a capability that was awesome. It's called FluCast, that we had developed in conjunction with Carnegie Mellon through a partnership we had with them. And it was, it has an amazing ability to predict incidents of the flu by geography in advance of patients showing up sick at a hospital. So that was a really helpful capability. We've obviously pivoted that to try to do the same for COVID as part of our COVID modeling efforts. In terms of future disease, it's a good question. I think without knowing what the disease is and from where it came and a little bit of about it, like so much of the modeling is based on trying to get the best knowledge around things like infection rates. We actually stopped using infection rate because there's not enough tests, right? We're now finding out, as everyone already knew, that way more people are infected than were being tested. And so we tried to focus on the things you could model, like hospitalizations for COVID, deaths by COVID, things like that. You take actual numbers and you can build off of those, and that informs the model better than kind of trying to guess at an infection rate. So until we have a little bit of that, it's sort of hard to model and predict future incidences of diseases. But the diseases we know, like the flu, we have an amazing capability that we help our clients with in terms of projecting, what's next year's flu season going to look like once it starts up, where is it likely to hit, what's it likely to mean for healthcare providers. So that's something we'll continue to do. On the care side, what's it going to look like? This is one person's opinion, and I honestly don't know. I think this is a time where if you're an entrepreneur, it's probably a really good time to be thinking about what's your vision of what care could look like based on what you're seeing during this crisis, and dive in a way to serve that. For sure, like you said, and like I mentioned earlier, there's going to be fewer and fewer. The system is not going to force you to go visit a doctor for a lot of conditions and a lot of ailments. Which it really did before for reimbursement purposes, and doctors, wouldn't necessarily be available for telehealth. They didn't get reimbursed at the same rate or at all. So you really needed to come into the office so they could get paid, and then you got to sit in the waiting room with other patients. I think all that stuff is going to be phased out over time. Even if you do have in-person visits, I think it's going to be a lot more sensitive to what we've seen during this crisis. Putting people together who are sick in a waiting room probably is a thing of the past. Will there be masks and better sanitation and more friendly ways of interacting? Will you come in and interact more with the screen than with a person? I just see all kinds of changes coming out about this that are going to be friendly for the consumer. And so people competing for your healthcare dollars will have to do all this stuff to be able to compete in a world down the line. It's hard to imagine going back to the old system, especially while there's still some risk out there from this current health crisis. Beyond that, I think there's going to be amazing innovations in things that a hospital does today that don't need to be done in a hospital. And so anything that can be plucked out of a hospital and done somewhere else is going to continue. That was a trend already happening, but I think you're going to see it accelerate. And I think with technology evolution, more and more things you'll find can be delivered at home. One of the things, there are a bunch of reasons, mostly structural, not necessarily technological. Think about dialysis treatments. Those always had to be done in dialysis centers with two main companies that deliver those. Well, the government was already pushing for more home dialysis equipment and support and reimbursement for those. This is going to make that much more prevalent. There are probably still some dialysis centers, but I think the business models of companies like that are going to have to change. A lot of infusions, people still going to get infusions for a lot of diseases and a lot of treatments. I think you'll see a movement for that to become enabled more and more at home. More specialty drugs can be administered at home. I just think you're going to continue to see a trend towards a business model evolving where things can be delivered or provided at home and still get the same type of reimbursement or financial support they could formerly in a hospital setting. So there'll be more of that. I think you'll see, with more and more, the population is still gradually moving into Medicare. So Medicare is still the fastest growing payer pool of all our payer pools in the country. And a lot of those are Medicare Advantage, which is privately run Medicare plans. And in those, there's been a ton of innovation. There was before the crisis, and there'll continue to be more and more innovation. And that's, providing through your healthcare plan, things like transportation, food, shelter, services, building a ramp to someone's house so they can get out and, have a better outlook on life, formerly stuck inside. All that kind of stuff, I think is going to be much more seen as associated with health benefits. And then the final thing, I think we're going to probably, having seen the disparity, how this plays out. Dr. Fauci today in his comments said, it's no surprise. It's no secret. So I'm not saying anything that's not well known, but you look at the disparity of how COVID's impacted African Americans as one example. There's been a whole history of African Americans that have a higher incidence of certain chronic health conditions. There are a number of reasons for that. We don't have to get into it right now, but it is true that they have a higher incidence of those conditions. And those are the conditions that make COVID cases likely to be more serious when people get them. And so as a result, you find that they're in the higher risk group for getting COVID. I think there'll be a lot of, when we get through all this and look at the numbers, there's going to be a lot of recognition of that as a consequence we as a nation don't want to tolerate anymore. And it's going to really cast a light on some of these disparity in health conditions that I hope will create a lot of room for innovation on the payment side, which then drives innovation on the services that get provided that can actually help us really make a dent in chronic disease in this country. So that may be a little bit of wishful thinking, but if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking for places to go, all these places are going to be places that we're going to need smart people running at.
One of the things that was interesting that you mentioned, so you think SDOH, addressing SDOH will become a part of Medicare payments, social determinants of health like transportation, grants, access to services?
It already is. It already is. If you look at the rules this year, for Medicare Advantage, they've allowed a lot more things to qualify. Well, for Medicare Advantage, insurers can choose what they spend the dollars on. So Medicare Advantage means the government gives United Healthcare X dollars to spend per patient. United figures out how to spend those, and if they do a good job, they'll recruit more people into their Medicare Advantage plans. If they don't, they'll lose people. So the reason why you've seen those plans becoming more and more popular is because there's been a lot of innovation in what those plans can do to take care of seniors. And yes, they're doing all kinds of things. United has made huge investments in housing, as have other insurers, in transportation and food. So social determinants, quote, so-called social determinants of health, are certainly being viewed more and more as critical factors for health. And so people who are accountable for people's health have an incentive to invest in those. And you're finally seeing some routes to do that. Even in regular Medicare, they're allowing, the trend has been under Seema Verna to allow more and more what you would previously consider to be social determinants type investing to count as reimbursable expenses under Medicare. So I think there's a growing recognition that those are really important elements that might actually go to increasing people's health. And if the thing about Medicare Advantage that's great is that people tend to stay with the same plan longer. Like if you're on your employer's healthcare plan, there's a reasonable amount of employee churn, and then employers change plans every couple of years. They compete it and bid it out to try to get better rates. And so you don't have one entity that tends to be accountable for someone's health over the long period. Employers are one, so the employers themselves who are self-insured have an interest in preserving health. But Medicare Advantage is the other place, and that's for seniors where you do have more and more health conditions. And so Medicare Advantage plans have a big incentive to invest early on in someone's health for investments that'll pay off over multiple years, because they'll be the beneficiaries of improved health over a longer time horizon. So it's one place where the incentives of those types of investments can actually work out as well. And as you see more and more people joining those plans, I think you'll see more and more of that type of investment, which I think is a huge positive as well.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So we had a handful of questions pop up. I'd love to turn it over to Todd to ask his question, and then we'll go through some of the ones in the chat as well.
Yeah, thanks again for joining. This has been fantastic. You actually kind of hit on my question to some extent, but this has obviously shown the disparity in care across socioeconomic stratification in the U.S. It's also shown the uninsured and the challenges with the uninsured today. Kind of two questions. One, if you had a clean slate, how would you fix that here in the U.S.? And two, just given the political dynamics here, what do you think will actually happen to try and fix that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll stay out of the political side of it, and I'll just focus on the economic side of it, which is the purest risk pool is one in which everyone's covered, right? So everyone's going to get healthcare in this country. It may be difficult to access it, but if you're really sick or you're injured, an ambulance can take you to hospital and they're going to care for you whether you're insured or not. And the question is just then, how does that get paid for most health conditions? I don't want to say that we have perfect access to care, because we definitely don't, but at the end of the day, if everyone is part of the risk pool, it is the most efficient way of paying for healthcare that you can have. And so I personally, and I know my company does, it supports universal coverage. Now, we might disagree about what that means. We would say there's a system set up that if carried out effectively, everyone can get coverage. And it's a question of creating the right incentives for everyone to get coverage, whether it's through an exchange or through an employer or through a public program. Others would say, let's mandate what that is and be sure that everyone is just handed coverage. There's a lot of different ways to get there, but I think we'd all agree that having everyone covered is the best system no matter what, because it's extremely, again, just taking the economic view, it's extremely inefficient to have uninsured people and yet still have a mandate to care for them. So those costs get borne by somebody, and it plays out through the system anyway. You might as well have them as part of an insurance plan and have some influence over their behavior and their care, and maybe be able to take care of them earlier, give someone an incentive to keep them in better health. So That's one. Number two, how that happens, I mean, you're getting into very specific policy arguments. The reality is that everyone could be covered. There's a mechanism to cover everyone today. It doesn't happen because of a number of reasons. You know, obviously, there hasn't been a strong enough mandate for people who can afford it to buy coverage. For those who can't afford it, you know, there is generally a system set up in most states where Medicaid covers the least able to afford it, but there's a big middle group who probably have trouble affording it, even though where the poverty line's drawn and the percentage of poverty would say they probably could. And so you have a lot of people that aren't covered in certain states there and can't afford to buy their own plan, even with the subsidy. And then employer healthcare really differs, and the way the economy has shifted, you know, there are a lot of employers who aren't really employers; they're just assembling independent contractors, and those people don't have healthcare provided through their employer, and so they have to access it individually. And many people choose not to make that expense. So, again, I'm not sure I'm helping answer your question, other than I think that there's a lot of smart people who've thought about this. There's a lot of policy solutions that can help with this, but I think that the first step is being sure that everyone does have coverage in whatever form, and then you can get to some of the next order questions, which is, okay, if you have that, then how do you work on managing the cost of care and the quality of care and steering people to the right side of care and the right doctor for the right condition. And we can do so much better on that front. You know, in our analytics, we have the capability to, for each individual person, be able to say, you know, for this condition that you have, not only where should you go for care, but which doctor is the best at treating patients like you with that condition. I mean, we have that capability today, but there's no incentive structure and no insurance structure that lets that be carried out across the country. But that would be a super efficient way to be thinking about how care is delivered and how we steer people to the best possible care for them. So anyway, I think that was a little bit of a rambling answer to your question. I apologize for it, but I would start with solutions to drive universal coverage, because I think then you at least have the ability to influence and make investments behind people's health that you don't when you have a lot of uninsured people walking around.
All right, thanks.
Great, thank you. Going back to Ekta's question here, she wanted to know about your transitions in your career, so going from Harvard Law to McKinsey, and then certainly on after that, and sort of in conjunction, as we're getting a little close on time here, I know there are a lot of students on the line, myself included. It would be really valuable to hear any specific advice you have from a career perspective.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second part and then make it personal to me. Advice on a career perspective, this is a tough time right now, so it's hard to judge the current environment, but we've been through periods like this before and come out of it with new opportunities. I've seen several of these now where it's hard when you're in it to look out the other side and say things are going to be okay, but things will be okay. It may be a year and a half before we really feel like they're okay, or even longer given the economic impact. But what always happens is there are opportunities and a next wave of types of things that evolve that create opportunities. And so I would, number one, just stay optimistic, stay observant, and recognize that this is, while it's a difficult time, it's a time of change, and change will create a lot of new opportunities. And, you know, you won't always pick the right one or the right company necessarily, and it may involve some work, but I think that especially if you're an entrepreneur, times like these are what create the opportunities out of which, you know, incredible companies, careers, accomplishments are you know, it's better to be looking at those now than it would have been 2 years ago in many ways. So you know, that's one positive way of looking at this with a little bit of the benefit of history. The second is, you know, for those of you who are interested in healthcare, it is an awesome place to go. It's a place that when I started in healthcare really was kind of sleepy. Like you'd be lucky if you saw one story a week in the Wall Street Journal about something healthcare related. Now it's on the front page every day. Obviously during the pandemic, but even before it, healthcare has turned into a place where we've recognized there's a big set of issues, and we have the technology and the attention from the government to really change things in a positive way. And so I think it's a great place for people to be looking at their career opportunities and saying, how can I make a difference in the world? I've always found that healthcare has this awesome benefit of you can work and do really cool work, and you're helping something that's really important in the world. And that's a great mission-centric way of viewing your work. And so I'm a huge fan of going into healthcare. And I think it's only going to keep growing, and it's going to keep growing in importance. And all these ways we talked about on this call, it's going to be changing. It needs smart people to come in and help the industry change in positive ways. So from a career perspective, I think it's a really neat time to go into healthcare. I mean, I was sort of lucky to find it. Honestly, I was trained as a lawyer. I clerked for a judge for a year, and then went to McKinsey. And at McKinsey, I worked in a bunch of different industries, really not healthcare, media, consumer, energy. I traveled, I lived in several different places, and only found the advisory board because I had a couple of friends who worked there and they were recruiting for a role. And they said, you should take a look at this company. And I really didn't even know what the company did. But I liked all the people when I interviewed. It seemed like a cool role. And it just seemed like, for me, moving from consulting to moving to a place where it wasn't just coming up with the ideas, but it was actually having to carry out the ideas and execute them, was something I always felt like fit me a little bit better. I didn't like that we always dissolved the team and moved on after solving a problem and never really got a chance to put it into action. So this job was everything that. So I came in and, I think ended up moving up into my current role through the advisory board in 2008, and I've loved it. And then, going to Optum, like, who knew? It's been an acquisition. You don't really know what you're getting yourself into or your company into. I think it's worked in a lot of ways, like I said at the beginning. And it's, for me, I learn a ton. And so I have always looked at it as be pretty open to opportunities that may come your way. Whatever career path you've mapped out on a piece of paper with a straight line, it's almost never going to play out that way. And I think, trust your instincts in knowing when it's time to do something different. And I have a couple of rules on that one. One is that you know yourself better than anybody. So if you're feeling like a role matches what you're looking for, you're probably right. You can get a lot of career advice, but inside you're going to have a good sense for what that is. Do your homework, understand the role, understand what it really means, what it could become. But at the end of the day, I think your instinct tells you a lot. The second is you can always find a place to make more money than you're making in your job today. So if you're looking for money, you're going to always be looking. There's so much more that goes into a job than compensation. And it's the people you work with, and it's the work you do, and it's the mission, and it's the, what you learn, and just all those things stack them up. I talk to employees all the time. They're like, oh, I got an offer. They're paying me more. And I'm like, well, do you want to do it? They're like, I don't know, but they're paying me more. And I'm like, well, that's one of 10 factors. So let's talk through those. It might not be the right call. There's always going to be someone who's going to pay more, but you might sub-optimize on the other factors. And then the final thing is, it's, at least for me, the factors that tend to drive the most satisfaction are who am I working with and am I learning? And it comes down to those. And that's been, again, like at Optum, I really like the people I work with. It's a lot of my ex-advisory board colleagues, and it's a lot of new colleagues who care a lot about healthcare, are smart people. They want to do right in the industry, and that's been great. And then I'm still learning a ton. Like, I'm learning all about these different parts of healthcare. I'm learning what it's like to be in a big company. I'm learning like how a company like Optum makes decisions or United makes decisions. And so for me, it's not just the actual day-to-day work, what I'm doing, but it's what I'm learning along the way that pick up a lot of experience and learning that'll help me either here if I stay or somewhere else along the line. So that's kind of the few career lessons I might share. And the thing that I would just come back and reemphasize in terms of career advice is this is going to be a unique time. It's going to feel kind of crappy for a while because there are not going to be a lot of jobs coming out of this right away. But there are going to be places that are going to need smart people. And if you're considering a career change, or your career's been disrupted, or you're just coming out of school, I think you're going to find that there's areas of real opportunity, and you'll have the option to get in at a, whatever it is, a ground floor of a new company or a depressed value of an existing company that's going to go through some change that you're going to help lead, or a company that's already booming but it's going to be expanding even more coming out of this based on the changes that are happening through healthcare and society. And so I would be optimistic and look forward and say, out of these negative times comes a lot of positive in the years that follow.
Great. Thank you so much for the advice. I know myself, along with other soon-to-be graduates here, it's really helpful to hear that perspective, and especially the optimism in this difficult time. With that said, though, we're close on time here, and I want to make sure I have time to pass it back over to Professor Goldberg. But Robert, thank you so much. It's been such a great opportunity, especially as a former employee, to hear more about your background, the transition over to Optum, and then certainly your perspective on COVID. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll pass it back over to Professor Goldberg.
Well, thanks, Allison. Great job moderating. A proud, all the advisory board alumni on the call and out there can see. I mean, it really is an amazing alumni group, as Robert mentioned. I'm bumping into former people that have sort of worked together and seen what you're doing, and we're excited for you to go out to Google. Robert, thank you for doing this. It's funny as you were recounting kind of your moments along the way. I mean, Robert and I both turned 50 in the last year. So as are all of our roommates, some of them are on the call. So it's just, we've been together for a lot of the journeys. I remember sitting with Robert outside the advisory board when he was interviewing for the CEO position, and sort of that decision and journey to do that. And Robert's son, oldest child, is going to be a freshman at Princeton this fall. And I remember when he was born and you guys brought him back from the hospital. So it's sort of all of us as we've gone through these sort of career and family journeys and watching, and it's exciting. And so thank you so much for doing this today. It's great. We're going to be back with another, we're off tomorrow, but on Friday, we're going to have the final of our Beyond Silicon Valley panels on sort of growing entrepreneurship in the crisis. And we're going to have a panel on access to capital. This is a challenging one in this time. So if you can join, and please check back on all the announcements. We've got a great series of speakers, and considering we've had Robert, and 2 weeks ago we had our other roommate, for as accomplished as Robert is, he holds nothing on Jonas Pate, who has the #1 show on Netflix, Outer Banks. So we keep stepping down. We go from Jay to Stuart's on. So we'll keep adding roommates as they go. But it's been fun to reconnect with everybody. So Robert, thank you so much for doing this, and for everybody for joining. Thank you guys for joining, and we'll hope to see you on another session soon.
Yeah, thank you all. This has been great. I appreciate all the questions, and I look forward to doing it in person in the future. And I'll participate in these going forward. These are fun,
Great.
Professor Goldberg. So sign me up.
We got
Good
it.
luck to
We
everybody,
have one tomorrow. Doug just reminded we have Ashi Bachu, who's got a great young entrepreneur doing a healthcare startup out in San Francisco. So we'll be back tomorrow at 1:00.
Great. Well, thank
Awesome.
you all. It's great to see those of you on the screen, and I appreciate all the questions, and I look forward to keeping in touch with those of you who want to, and Michael will be in touch.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.